They thought I would bow down when they blocked my ranch gate with a concrete slab. I just laughed. They had no idea who they were dealing with. A retired real estate engineer with too much free time and a well-stocked bank account. When I bought the entire street and tripled their HOA fees, Patricia's face turned as white as paper. But that was just the beginning of my revenge. Where are you watching this video from? Drop a comment below. I'm really curious. And brace yourself to see the extreme payback of a mild-mannered man pushed to his breaking point. After 30 years of navigating the complex world of real estate development, my wife Elaine and I had finally achieved our dream. We purchased a beautiful 5-acre ranch property just outside of Oakwood Estates, an upscale suburban development in Colorado. The property had everything we wanted: a charming main house, beautiful views of the mountains, and most importantly, privacy. We'd worked hard all our lives, and this was our reward. Elaine, a sharp-minded retired corporate attorney, was as excited as I was about this new chapter. Our first project was to replace the old, rusty entrance gate with something more fitting for our dream property, a beautiful wooden ranch gate with stone columns on either side. It wasn't flashy or ostentatious, just tasteful and well-built, like everything else we wanted for our retirement home. We hired contractors, got the permits, and began construction on our gate. Everything was proceeding smoothly, or so we thought. One morning in early spring, I headed out to check on the gate construction progress, coffee mug in hand, anticipating another peaceful day in our new paradise. What I found instead made me stop in my tracks. A massive concrete block, easily weighing over a ton, had been placed directly in front of our half-finished gate entrance, completely blocking access to our property. Next to it was a printed notice with the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association logo prominently displayed at the top. The notice stated in bold lettering that our gate construction violated community aesthetic guidelines and was to be immediately discontinued. I stood there, utterly bewildered. Our property wasn't even part of Oakwood Estates. We had specifically chosen this parcel because it was independent, with no HOA oversight. I called Elaine, who immediately joined me at the blockade. As we were examining the concrete block and the notice, wondering how to proceed, a luxury SUV pulled up beside us. A woman in her early 60s with immaculately styled blonde hair, dressed in what was clearly an expensive designer outfit, stepped out and approached us with the confidence of someone used to getting her way. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, I'm Patricia Whitmore, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association," she announced without bothering with pleasantries. "I see you've received our notice about your rustic construction project." The way she pronounced rustic made it sound like she was referring to garbage. I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "Ms. Whitmore, there must be some misunderstanding. Our property isn't part of Oakwood Estates. We specifically verified that before purchasing." Patricia's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "The property may not be, Mr. Morgan, but the access road certainly is. Check your paperwork. This road belongs to our community, and we have full authority over what structures can be seen from it. Your farm entrance is an eyesore that will decrease property values in our prestigious community." Before I could respond, she handed me another document, a formal cease and desist order. "This has been approved by our board. I suggest you comply to avoid further complications. We have excellent connections with the county commissioners. You know." As Patricia strutted back to her vehicle, I stood there, the paper crumpling slightly in my grip. Elaine, always the attorney, was already reviewing the document. "Jack," she said quietly, "we need to check the property records. If she's right about the road—" I nodded, still staring at the concrete block that now barred our way home. After 30 years in real estate development, I knew that property line disputes could be complex, but this felt different. This felt like a challenge, a power play by someone used to bullying others into submission. What Patricia didn't know was that she had just picked a fight with exactly the wrong person. As we turned to head back to the house, taking the long way around through our neighbor's driveway, thankfully David Cooper was a friendly former military man who had no love for the HOA either, Elaine squeezed my hand. "They don't know who they've just messed with," she whispered. I nodded, my mind already mapping out possibilities and strategies. The battle had just begun. The next morning, I was up at dawn, poring over our property documents spread across our dining room table. Elaine joined me, bringing fresh coffee and her legal expertise. By midday, a troubling picture had emerged. While our ranch property was indeed outside the HOA's jurisdiction, the short access road connecting our entrance to the main street technically fell within Oakwood Estates' boundaries. The original developer had included this strip of land in the community plans, but had never properly transferred our access easement when our parcel was subdivided years ago. It was a technical oversight that Patricia Whitmore had obviously discovered and was now exploiting. "This is ridiculous," Elaine said, pushing away a stack of papers in frustration. "They can't just block access to our property. There are right-of-ways laws, easement by necessity principles." I agreed, but knew that fighting this through conventional channels could take months, if not years. And during that time, we'd be at the mercy of Patricia's whims. We needed specialized help, someone who understood both real estate law and the specific challenges posed by overzealous HOAs. That afternoon, we contacted Maya Patel, a brilliant real estate attorney known for helping homeowners against predatory HOA practices. She agreed to meet us the next day. Maya arrived at our home precisely on time, a petite woman with an immediately evident intensity and intelligence. "Tell me everything," she said as we sat on our back porch overlooking the mountains, a view we currently had to enjoy by taking the long way around our property since our front entrance remained blocked. As we explained our situation, she took detailed notes, occasionally asking sharp, precise questions. When we finished, she sat back and gave us a measured look. "The HOA is technically correct about the road ownership, but they're grossly overstepping their authority by blocking access to your property. That's potentially illegal. However, fighting them directly through legal channels could be lengthy and expensive. HOAs have deep pockets and can drag these things out." Then she asked a question that would change everything. "Have you looked into who actually owns the road itself?" I frowned, not understanding. "The HOA does, right?" Maya smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. "Not necessarily. HOAs don't always own the roads in their communities. Sometimes the roads remain the property of the original developer, with the HOA having management rights by agreement. And sometimes, especially if the developer went bankrupt or restructured, ownership can be complicated." She pulled out her laptop and showed us how to access the county's property records database. Together, we spent hours digging through digital archives, following a paper trail that had been gathering dust for years. What we discovered was astonishing. The road in question, Oakwood Lane, had never been properly transferred to the HOA. The original developer, Westfield Properties, had gone bankrupt during the 2008 financial crisis, and while most of the community assets had been properly assigned to the newly formed Homeowners Association, several parcels, including our access road, had been acquired by a holding company during the bankruptcy proceedings. This company, Sierra Holdings, LLC, appeared to be a passive investment entity that likely had no idea they owned this small strip of asphalt in a Colorado suburb. "So the HOA doesn't actually own the road they're blocking us from using?" I said slowly, the implications dawning on me. Maya nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "They likely have a management agreement, but actual ownership? No. And here's where it gets interesting. Sierra Holdings has been dormant for years. They've been paying the minimal property taxes automatically, but they might be very open to selling this asset that's just sitting on their books." The three of us looked at each other, the same thought clearly forming. "What if I bought the road?" I asked, feeling a surge of excitement I hadn't experienced since my working days. "Could I actually do that?" Maya's smile widened. "Let me make some calls." The next day, while we were still processing this revelation, we received another unwelcome visit from Patricia Whitmore, this time accompanied by Robert Green, the HOA's vice president. An overweight man in his 60s wearing a golf shirt that strained against his belly and a Rolex watch he made sure was visible with every exaggerated gesture. "The board has reviewed your situation," Patricia announced without preamble, "and we're willing to allow your gate construction to continue if you make certain modifications." The proposal they outlined was ridiculous. Our simple, tasteful ranch entrance would need to be replaced with something that matched Oakwood Estates' Mediterranean villa aesthetic, complete with stucco columns and wrought iron. The cost would triple, and the result would look completely out of place on our ranch property. When we politely declined, Robert stepped forward, his tone condescending. "You people need to understand that Oakwood Estates has the highest property values in the county. We don't achieve that by letting just anyone put up whatever eyesore they fancy." The thinly veiled contempt in his voice made my blood boil, but years of business negotiations had taught me to control my reactions. "We'll take your suggestions under advisement," I said neutrally. After they left, Elaine turned to me with a determined look. "Jack, we need to make those calls to Sierra Holdings immediately." I couldn't have agreed more. As we worked with Maya to contact Sierra Holdings, we also began gathering information about the HOA itself. Our neighbor David proved invaluable, introducing us to other homeowners who had clashed with Patricia's regime. The stories were remarkably similar: arbitrary rule enforcement, selective targeting, and an atmosphere of intimidation. More concerning were the whispers about financial irregularities. The annual landscaping budget doubled last year, one resident told us confidentially, but half the community's trees died because they cut back on watering to save money. Nobody knows where the extra funds went. We carefully documented everything, building a dossier that might prove useful later. Maya put it best when she placed the folder of documents on our table. Jack, do you know what happens when HOA administrators discover they no longer control their own roads? I smiled. I don't know, but I'm certainly going to enjoy finding out. Contacting Sierra Holdings proved more straightforward than we anticipated, thanks to connections from my years in the industry. A former colleague now worked for the investment group that managed Sierra's dormant assets and was intrigued by my interest in the seemingly worthless strip of asphalt. It's been sitting on our books for years, he explained during our call. The property taxes are minimal, but honestly, it's just administrative overhead for us at this point. I kept my explanation vague, just a property owner looking to secure access to my land, and was careful not to reveal the true strategic value of the purchase. After some negotiation, we settled on a surprisingly reasonable price. The holding company was simply happy to offload a non-performing asset, and I was more than happy to take it off their hands. While we waited for the paperwork to be processed, Patricia and her cronies intensified their campaign against us. Each day brought new notices of alleged violations. Our mailbox was non-compliant. The color of our house trim was unapproved. Even the native wildflowers we'd planted were deemed inappropriate vegetation. Robert Greene seemed to take particular pleasure in delivering these notices personally, always with the same smug smile. We documented each one meticulously, following Maya's advice to build our case while keeping our actual plans secret. Let them think they're winning, she counseled. The element of surprise will be invaluable when the time comes. Elaine, meanwhile, had been putting her legal skills to good use. She discovered that Patricia had been serving as HOA president for 8 consecutive years, despite bylaws limiting terms to 3 years. The explanation was buried in meeting minutes that few residents ever read. The board had granted themselves emergency extensions during the pandemic, then simply never relinquished the additional powers. More concerning were the financial discrepancies she uncovered. The HOA's reserve fund showed unexplained withdrawals coinciding with Patricia's kitchen renovation and Robert's new boat purchase. Nothing was definitively provable yet, but the pattern was suspicious enough to warrant further investigation. The weeks dragged on, with the concrete blocks still blocking our gate. We were forced to use David Cooper's driveway to access our property, a generous accommodation from our neighbor but an indignity nonetheless. David himself had become a target of the HOA's wrath due to his friendship with us. He received a violation notice for his American flag display, allegedly too large, despite it being identical to ones displayed by other residents who were on friendly terms with Patricia. They've done this for years, David told us one evening as we shared drinks on his porch. Find some minor rule violation and use it to make people's lives miserable if they don't fall in line. Most folks eventually give up and move away. His expression hardened. But I'm not moving. This was my father's house, and I'll be damned if I let some power-hungry busybody drive me out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of bureaucratic delays, the call came from Maya. "Congratulations, Jack," she said, her voice vibrating with suppressed excitement. "You are now the proud owner of approximately 0.7 miles of asphalt officially known as Oakwood Lane." I felt a surge of triumph as I signed the final documents in her office that afternoon. We agreed to keep the purchase quiet for just a little longer while Maya prepared the legal notification. As I drove home that evening, taking the long way around as had become our custom, I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. Patricia Whitmore had no idea that while she was busy with her petty harassment campaign, I had quietly removed the most valuable piece from the board. The next morning, Maya arrived at our home with a stack of official-looking documents and a barely contained grin. "These are the formal notices informing the Oakwood Estates HOA that ownership of their access road has changed hands," she explained as we reviewed the paperwork. "I've also prepared this letter outlining the new access agreements they'll need to sign if they wish to continue using the road. The terms were reasonable but firm. The HOA would need to acknowledge our right of access to our property, remove any barriers immediately, and agree to a monthly maintenance fee that, by sheer coincidence, amounted to exactly 3 times their current HOA dues." "Is this legal?" Elaine asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. Maya nodded confidently. "Absolutely, as the property owner, Jack has every right to establish terms for the use of his private road. They can negotiate, of course, but their position is much weaker than they realize." We decided that I would deliver the documents personally the next day during the HOA's monthly board meeting. That evening, as we prepared our approach, we received an unexpected visit from Marcus Sullivan, the city clerk. David had introduced us previously, mentioning that Marcus was one of the few city officials who hadn't been charmed or intimidated by Patricia Whitmore. "I heard through the grapevine that you've acquired the Oakwood Lane property," he said after declining our offer of coffee. "Thought you might want to know that Miss Whitmore has been making calls to various departments, trying to find a way to challenge any change in ownership." His expression was carefully neutral, but there was a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Of course, all property transactions that follow proper legal procedures are fully recognized by the city, regardless of who might object. The next evening, I dressed in my best suit, not the flashiest in my closet, but certainly the one that projected the most authority. Maya accompanied me to the HOA meeting held in the community clubhouse. We waited quietly at the back of the room while Patricia ran through the agenda items, watching as she arbitrarily approved some residents' requests while denying others with barely concealed contempt. Finally, during the new business segment, I raised my hand. Patricia's expression soured immediately upon seeing me. "Mr. Morgan, this meeting is for Oakwood Estates residents only," she said dismissively. "Since you've made it abundantly clear that your property is not part of our community, you have no business here." I smiled pleasantly as I stood. "Actually, Ms. Whitmore, I very much do have business here. As of yesterday, I am the legal owner of Oakwood Lane, the road that provides access to all homes in this community." A shocked murmur rippled through the room. Patricia's face froze in disbelief. "That's impossible," she sputtered. "The road belongs to the association?" Maya stepped forward then, handing copies of the property deed and transfer documents to each board member. "I'm afraid Mr. Morgan is correct," she said with professional calm. "The road was never properly transferred to the HOA after the original developer's bankruptcy. It has been owned by Sierra Holdings for the past 15 years, and as of yesterday, ownership has been legally transferred to Mr. Morgan." The room erupted in chaos. Robert Green's face turned an alarming shade of purple as he shouted about lawsuits and injunctions. Patricia attempted to regain control, banging her gavel and demanding silence, but the residents ignored her, bombarding us with questions. Maya handled them masterfully, explaining in simple terms what this meant for the community. I watched Patricia and Robert exchange panicked glances, clearly realizing how completely the tables had turned. Finally, Patricia managed to adjourn the meeting, announcing that the board would review the situation with their attorneys. As people filed out, many cast worried glances our way, while others, those who had suffered under Patricia's regime, seemed to be suppressing smiles. When we returned home that evening, I poured myself a whiskey and sat in our living room, watching footage from the security camera that David had installed in the meeting room. Patricia was nearly screaming at the remaining board members while Robert paced anxiously, repeatedly checking his phone. The storm was just beginning to form, and I, the man they had dismissed so casually, had now become the one controlling that storm. The next morning, I hired a local contractor to remove the concrete block blocking our gate. Patricia must have been watching, because she appeared within minutes, accompanied by Robert and 2 workers from the community's maintenance company. "Stop this immediately," she demanded, stepping directly in front of the excavator. "You have no authority to modify HOA property." I simply handed her a copy of the property deed. "This isn't HOA property anymore, Ms. Whitmore. It's my property, and I'm removing an unauthorized obstruction from it." She snatched the paper from my hand, her face contorted with rage. "This changes nothing. Our attorneys will overturn this trickery." Nevertheless, she was forced to stand aside as the concrete block was lifted and removed. That afternoon, Maya delivered the official usage agreement to the HOA office, along with the first invoice for road access fees. I deliberately set the amount at exactly 3 times the monthly HOA dues that Oakwood Estates residents paid, a bit of poetic justice that wasn't lost on Maya. "They'll fight this," she warned as we discussed next steps. "Patricia has too much ego invested to back down easily." She was right. By evening, the HOA's attorney had contacted her, flatly rejecting our terms and threatening legal action. What's more, Patricia had apparently ordered an even larger concrete block placed in front of our gate, a desperate and ultimately futile gesture that only strengthened our legal position. The next day, I took another step that would bring matters to a head. I had proper signage installed at both entrances to Oakwood Lane. Pindwood Road, access by permission only. Below, in slightly smaller lettering, for access permits, contact Morgan Properties, LLC. The signs were tasteful and discreet, far more so than they legally needed to be, but their message was unmistakable. I also arranged for security cameras to be installed, covering the entire length of the road. That night, as I suspected they might, someone attempted to remove the signs. The security footage clearly showed Robert Greene personally kicking over one sign and attempting to uproot the other, only giving up when he couldn't manage it with his hands alone. The community was now in an uproar. Maya's phone rang constantly with calls from worried residents who had suddenly realized their homes were accessible only via a private road they had no legal right to use. Patricia hastily called another HOA meeting, but this time, instead of the usual handful of attendees, nearly every household was represented. As David reported back to us, we chose not to attend, letting the pressure build. Patricia had attempted to reassure everyone that the situation was under control and that their attorneys would quickly resolve the misunderstanding, but the residents weren't buying it anymore. They wanted to know how the board had allowed this to happen, where the road maintenance fees they'd been paying for years had actually gone, and most importantly, whether they were at risk of losing access to their own homes. The following morning, I filed a formal police report regarding the vandalism of our property, complete with crystal-clear video evidence of Robert Greene destroying the signage. By afternoon, he had received a visit from local police and a citation for criminal mischief. It was a minor charge, but the humiliation of having police at his door was exactly the kind of public embarrassment that someone like Robert, so conscious of status and appearances, would find intolerable. Meanwhile, Elaine continued her meticulous investigation into the HOA's finances, uncovering more evidence of mismanagement and potential misappropriation. When Robert Greene arrogantly walked away after kicking down my sign, he didn't realize his actions had been clearly recorded from 3 different angles. Sometimes, the best enemy is one too confident in their own victory. With Robert now facing a criminal charge, however minor, and our ownership of the road firmly established legally, the dynamics of the conflict began to shift. Patricia attempted to rally the community against us, sending out a community-wide email portraying us as vindictive outsiders, trying to extort honest homeowners. Her efforts backfired spectacularly when Elaine responded with a calm, point-by-point rebuttal, copying all residents and including documentation of how we had been treated from the beginning. More damaging to Patricia was the question Elaine raised about the HOA's financial management, specifically how residents' dues had been spent on road maintenance for a road the HOA didn't actually own. If the board was unaware of this discrepancy, it demonstrates incompetence, Elaine wrote. If they were aware, it raises more troubling questions. I decided to turn up the pressure another notch by implementing a parking permit system for Oakwood Lane. Any vehicle parked along the roadside without a permit would be subject to towing at the owner's expense. This directly challenged one of Patricia's favorite enforcement tactics. She routinely had visitors' cars towed if they parked on the street overnight, citing HOA regulations. Now, those regulations were meaningless as I, not the HOA, controlled parking rights on the road. I made sure the first permits were issued free of charge to all residents except board members, who would have to apply separately. It was petty, perhaps, but it made the power shift concrete in a way everyone could understand. The community began to fracture visibly. Many residents, particularly those who had clashed with Patricia in the past, started to openly support us. David Cooper became something of a spokesman for this faction, unafraid to challenge the board publicly. Others, friends and allies of Patricia, dug in their heels, refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of our ownership, despite the clear legal documentation. The HOA hired an expensive attorney from Denver, but even he seemed uncertain about their legal standing, advising them in carefully worded letters to consider negotiation rather than litigation. Patricia rejected this advice outright, convinced that her connections with local officials would eventually prevail. The pressure continued to mount when I installed an automated gate at one entrance to Oakwood Lane, requiring residents to use a keycard for access. I immediately distributed free keycards to all households except the board members. When Patricia called, apoplectic with rage, demanding access, I calmly explained that board members could submit their applications through the proper channels, just as they had required me to do for every minor property adjustment. "You can't do this," she sputtered through the phone. "People need to get to their homes," I replied with the same words she had used on me weeks earlier. "I'm simply enforcing reasonable standards to maintain community values. I'm sure you understand the importance of following proper procedures." The silence on the other end of the line was deeply satisfying. The situation escalated further when several of Patricia's closest allies on the board found their water bills had mysteriously tripled. It turned out the water company had been accessing meters via an easement along Oakwood Lane, and without proper permits, they were now being charged commercial access fees rather than utility rates. I hadn't planned this particular complication, but I certainly didn't rush to resolve it either. The affected board members had to publicly request my assistance, a humbling experience for people who had been treating me like an unwelcome intruder for months. I graciously resolved the issue after they submitted formal, written apologies for their treatment of my family. As tensions rose, David organized a group of residents to research the HOA's historical records. What they uncovered was alarming. Years of selective enforcement against certain homeowners, financial discrepancies that suggested mismanagement at best and embezzlement at worst, and minutes from executive sessions revealing Patricia's explicit strategy to target anyone who challenged her authority. "She's been running this place like a small-town dictator," David told me over coffee one morning, sliding a folder of documents across the table, "and people are finally waking up to it." Things came to a head at an emergency community meeting called by residents themselves, not the board. The clubhouse was packed, with people standing along the walls when all seats were filled. Patricia and the board sat at the front, looking increasingly uncomfortable as residents demanded explanations. I attended with Maya, staying quietly at the back until specifically addressed. When questions turned to the road ownership issue, Patricia attempted to dismiss it as a temporary legal confusion, but was interrupted by Marcus Sullivan, who had been invited by concerned residents. As city clerk, his statement carried significant weight. The property records are clear and unambiguous. Oakwood Lane is privately owned by Mr. Morgan and has never been the property of the Homeowners Association, despite what residents may have been led to believe. The meeting devolved into near chaos after that revelation. Some residents demanded the board's immediate resignation, while others called for a forensic audit of the HOA's finances. Through it all, Patricia maintained her composure, though the strain showed in her tightened jaw and the white-knuckled grip she maintained on the edge of the table. When directly asked what options the community had, Maya stepped forward and outlined the agreement we had proposed. Fair access rights for all residents in exchange for reasonable fees and the removal of any barriers to our property. Mr. Morgan has no desire to restrict anyone's access to their home, she explained. He simply wants the harassment of his family to end and his own property rights to be respected. One elderly resident who'd been silent throughout the meeting suddenly stood up, his voice quavering with emotion. "I've lived here for 15 years, and I've paid over $20,000 in road maintenance fees during that time. I want to know where that money went if we don't even own the road." His question hung in the air as Patricia visibly paled. Another resident, a young mother I recognized from neighborhood walks, added, "My family was fined $300 last month because our garbage cans were visible from the street for an extra day while I was at the hospital with my son. Meanwhile, you've been spending our money on a road that isn't ours? This isn't right." The murmurs of agreement swept through the room like a wave. Patricia, sensing that public opinion was turning against her, attempted one last desperate maneuver. "Mr. Morgan is holding this entire community hostage," she declared, rising to her feet. "He's demanding exorbitant fees just for us to use our own road." Maya calmly countered with facts. "The proposed fee is exactly what the HOA has been charging its members for road maintenance all these years, maintenance of a road it didn't own. If the amount is exorbitant now, it was equally exorbitant when you were collecting it." The room fell silent as this point sank in. I finally spoke up, keeping my voice level despite the tension in the room. "We can negotiate like civilized people," I said, "or we can continue this game, but I should warn you, I have a lot of free time on my hands." The day after the community meeting, I received a surprising phone call. Robert Green wanted to meet privately, away from Patricia and the other board members. We agreed to talk at a coffee shop in the next town over, where we were unlikely to be seen by any Oakwood Estates residents. Robert arrived looking significantly less polished than usual, his designer golf shirt replaced by a plain button-down, his usual confident swagger absent. He wasted no time getting to the point. "I want out of this mess. Patricia has gone too far, and I'm not going down with her." What followed was a remarkable confession. According to Robert, Patricia had been manipulating the HOA's finances for years, using community funds for personal expenses and falsifying reports to the membership. He claimed to have objected initially but had eventually been compromised himself when Patricia arranged for HOA funds to pay for his boat under the guise of community water safety equipment. I listened without interrupting, recording our conversation with Robert's knowledge and consent. When he finished, I asked the obvious question. "Why are you telling me this now?" His answer was equal parts pathetic and pragmatic. Because you've won. Patricia doesn't see it yet, but I do, and I want to negotiate my own surrender before everything collapses. He offered to provide documentation of financial misconduct in exchange for my agreement not to pursue further legal action against him personally regarding the sign vandalism and his role in blocking our property access. It was a self-serving offer, but potentially valuable for our purposes. I told him I would consider it and discuss with my attorney. After consulting with Maya and Elaine, we decided to accept Robert's offer, but with additional conditions. He would need to resign from the board immediately, return any misappropriated funds, and publicly acknowledge the legitimacy of our road ownership. Robert agreed with surprising readiness, clearly more concerned with saving himself than maintaining loyalty to Patricia. Within days, he provided us with a thumb drive containing damning financial records. Fabricated invoices, board meeting minutes with sections deleted before distribution to residents, and emails between Patricia and select board members discussing how to conceal certain expenditures from community scrutiny. Armed with this new evidence, we refined our demands to the HOA. First, Patricia and any board members implicated in financial improprieties would need to resign immediately. Second, a new board would be elected by residents, with term limits strictly enforced. Third, the HOA would formally acknowledge our property rights and remove any remaining barriers to our access. Finally, they would need to agree to our road usage terms, including the maintenance fees we had proposed. I instructed Maya to present these terms not as a request, but as a non-negotiable settlement offer, with the clear implication that rejection would lead to both civil litigation and potential criminal charges for financial fraud. The response was swift and divided. Patricia predictably rejected the terms outright and accused us of fabricating evidence to smear her reputation. The other board members, however, having seen the documentation Robert provided, began to distance themselves from her, issuing carefully worded statements about their limited involvement in financial decisions and their commitment to community transparency. Robert, true to his word, submitted his resignation, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. The community itself was in turmoil, with impromptu gatherings in driveways and heated exchanges on the neighborhood's social media group. I watched this unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and weariness. This had long since ceased to be about our gate or even our access rights. It had become a necessary cleansing of a toxic leadership that had abused its power for years. When Robert left my house, visibly shaking with the evidence of his betrayal of Patricia in my hands, he whispered, "You don't understand. She'll destroy me." I just smiled. "No, Robert, you destroyed yourselves when you decided to block my gate." A special community meeting was called to vote on the future of the HOA leadership and to address the road access crisis, as it was now being called. The clubhouse couldn't accommodate everyone who wanted to attend, so the meeting was moved to the local high school gymnasium. As Elaine and I took our seats, we could feel the tension in the air. This would be the reckoning that had been building for weeks. Patricia arrived last, her usual impeccable appearance now showing signs of strain, her smile tight and forced as she made her way to the front. The current board treasurer, clearly uncomfortable, presented the evidence of financial discrepancies that had now been independently verified by an accountant hired by concerned residents. Patricia's defense was both predictable and desperate. She characterized the investigation as a witch hunt orchestrated by outsiders, meaning us, and suggested that any financial irregularities were mere bookkeeping errors rather than deliberate misappropriation. "I have given 8 years of my life to this community," she declared, her voice rising. "I have maintained property values and community standards while the rest of the county declined, and this is the thanks I get? Accusations from people who don't even live here?" It might have been a compelling performance had Robert not chosen that moment to enter the gymnasium, accompanied by a police detective. The investigation into the HOA's finances was now officially criminal, and Robert's plea deal required his full cooperation. What followed was both dramatic and deeply satisfying. One by one, residents stood to share stories of how Patricia's leadership had affected them. An elderly couple described being fined repeatedly for a wheelchair ramp they needed, but which violated HOA aesthetic standards. A young family told how they had been threatened with litigation for installing an autism-friendly sensory garden for their child. David Cooper, commanding attention with his military bearing, detailed the systematic targeting of anyone who challenged Patricia's authority. Through it all, Patricia sat rigidly, her expression hardening as her support visibly eroded with each testimony. When it came time to vote, the outcome was overwhelming. Patricia and the entire board were removed from their positions, with an interim leadership committee established until proper elections could be held. The community also voted to accept our proposed road access agreement, acknowledging our ownership rights while securing their access needs. As a gesture of goodwill, I announced that I would consider transferring ownership of the road back to the community, not the HOA, under specific conditions that would protect all parties' interests, including our own unhindered access to our property. This unexpected offer changed the atmosphere in the room, shifting it from vindictive satisfaction to cautious optimism about a more collaborative future. Patricia, unable to accept her defeat with dignity, stormed out of the meeting with a final threat. "You'll be hearing from my attorneys. You can't destroy someone's reputation like this without consequences." But no one even turned to watch her leave. Instead, they were listening to my vision for how the community could truly become a place where people wanted to live, not a place they feared. Over the following weeks, the Oakwood Estates community underwent a remarkable transformation. With Patricia and her allies removed from power, residents began to engage with neighborhood governance in ways they never had before. The interim committee, which included David Cooper and several other thoughtful community members, worked diligently to revise HOA bylaws, focusing on transparency, reasonable enforcement, and genuine community enhancement rather than punitive control. I provided guidance when asked, but otherwise stayed in the background, allowing the healing process to unfold organically. True to my word, I drafted an agreement to transfer ownership of Oakwood Lane back to a newly created community trust, with binding covenants that protected all residents' access rights, including ours. The agreement included safeguards against future abuse of power, including a requirement that any changes to access policies would need approval from 75% of affected property owners, not just the HOA board. Maya helped structure the legal framework, ensuring it would withstand any future challenges while serving the community's best interests. The road would truly belong to everyone, not used as a weapon by the few against the many. Patricia, meanwhile, attempted to make good on her threat of legal action, filing a defamation suit against me, Elaine, and several community members who had spoken out. Her case was weak from the start and became weaker still when her own attorneys withdrew from representing her after reviewing the financial evidence. Within months, she quietly dropped the lawsuit and put her house on the market, unwilling to face her former neighbors daily. Robert Greene had already moved away, selling his home at a significant loss just to escape the whispers and sidelong glances that followed him around the community. The police investigation into the financial mismanagement continued, with indications that formal charges would eventually be filed. As spring turned to summer, we finally completed the ranch gate that had started this entire conflict. It was exactly as we had originally planned, tasteful, appropriate for a ranch property, and entirely on our own land. We held a small celebration when it was finished, inviting neighbors who had supported us throughout the ordeal. David Cooper brought his famous barbecue, and several families brought side dishes and desserts. It felt like the community gathering that Oakwood Estates should have been all along. People of different backgrounds and ages coming together as neighbors rather than adversaries. The formal announcement from the district attorney's office came just days after our gate celebration. Patricia Whitmore was being charged with multiple counts of financial fraud and misappropriation of funds. The investigation had revealed even more extensive misconduct than Robert had initially disclosed, including a pattern of kickbacks from preferred vendors who overcharged for community services. The news made local headlines, further cementing Patricia's downfall from respected community leader to alleged criminal. I took no joy in her legal troubles. Justice was necessary. But watching someone's life unravel is never a pleasant spectacle, even when they've earned their consequences. As I stood before our newly completed ranch gate with Elaine by my side, I couldn't help but smile. The battle had never really been about a gate or a road. It had been about respect, fairness, and the way we choose to live together. The concrete block that had started it all, I repurposed it into a small fountain at the entrance to the community, with a discreet plaque reading, "Dedicated to the Oakwood community. It's never too late to do the right thing." No one understood its true significance except those of us who had lived through the conflict, and that was perhaps the sweetest victory of all. Last week I ran into Patricia at the local supermarket. She quickly turned away, unable to meet my eyes. I simply nodded politely and continued with my shopping. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemy, but living well after it's all over. The new HOA leadership invited me to serve as an advisor on their planning committee, an ironic twist that wasn't lost on anyone involved. I accepted, believing that my experience in real estate development could genuinely benefit the community. At our first meeting, someone asked why I hadn't simply given up when confronted with Patricia's obstruction. Because principles matter, I replied. When someone tries to bully you off your own property using rules they invented, standing firm isn't just about your rights. It's about ensuring they can't do the same to someone else tomorrow. Elaine and I finally have the peaceful retirement we planned for. Our ranch is thriving, with a small garden that supplies most of our produce and enough space for our grandchildren to run wild when they visit. We've become genuine parts of the community, not the outsiders Patricia tried to paint us as. And every time I drive through our gate, I'm reminded that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought not just for yourself, but for the principle of the thing. If there's a lesson in all this, perhaps it's that bullies rely on people backing down. They count on most folks deciding that the fight isn't worth the trouble, and usually they're right. Many battles aren't worth fighting, but occasionally you encounter one that matters beyond the immediate issue. When that happens, standing your ground isn't stubbornness, it's necessary. And if you happen to have the knowledge, resources, and determination to turn the tables completely, well, that's just poetic justice. The HOA that blocked my ranch gate couldn't have known they were picking a fight with someone who had the exact skill set and temperament to dismantle their little kingdom. By trying to assert control over my property, they lost control of their own. By blocking my access, they ultimately lost exclusive rights to theirs, and in the end, everyone except those who abused their power ended up better off. I call that a happy ending worth fighting for.